My mother-in-law Eleanor set down her wine glass at her own anniversary dinner and said, loud enough for the table to hear, "You'll never fit in our family. You're simply not the kind of person we are." And 10 minutes later, there were 2 police officers standing in her dining room, asking very specific questions about a car parked illegally in front of a fire hydrant outside her house. And the car belonged to Eleanor. And Eleanor had no idea whose name was actually on the registration because she had borrowed it from her son 3 days earlier without checking the paperwork. And the registration, as it turned out, was in my name. Because it was my car, the one I had lent my husband for the week while his was in the shop. And Eleanor stood there in front of 2 officers explaining that she did not know who owned the vehicle she had been driving for 3 days, in the same dining room where 10 minutes earlier she had informed me I would never really belong. Hi everyone! Welcome back! And if this is the first video of mine you've ever clicked on, well, today you get a story with genuinely excellent timing. So stay with me because the sequence of events here is almost too perfect to be believed. Except it actually happened exactly this way. My name is Renata Castillo, and I am 31 years old. And I have been married to my husband David for 2 years. And my mother-in-law Eleanor has made it clear since the wedding that she considers me an outsider, not because of anything specific I have done, but because of a general sense she has never quite articulated except in moments like this anniversary dinner, where apparently 3 glasses of wine in, she felt comfortable saying it directly instead of implying it the way she usually does. The dinner was for Eleanor and her husband Frank's 40th wedding anniversary, and the extended family had gathered at their house, and David and I had arrived early because David's car was in the shop for routine maintenance, and I had lent him mine for the week. A sensible silver sedan registered entirely in my name because I had bought it outright 2 years before we married. And when we arrived, Eleanor mentioned that her own car was making a strange noise and asked if she could borrow mine for a quick errand before the other guests arrived. And David said, sure, that's fine, not thinking to mention whose car it technically was, because to David it was simply our car, the one parked in the driveway. And Eleanor took my keys and drove to the store and came back and parked it on the street in front of the house because the driveway was filling up with other guests' cars. The comment happened over dessert. Frank had given a toast about 40 years of marriage and family, and Eleanor, who had been drinking steadily and growing looser with her usual filtering, looked across the table at me during a lull in conversation and said, apropos of very little, "You know, Renata, I've thought about this for 2 years now, and I think the honest truth is you'll never fit in our family. You're simply not the kind of person we are." And the table went quiet in the specific way tables go quiet when someone has said something true enough to be uncomfortable. And David said, "Mom." And Eleanor said, "I'm just being honest, David. Someone should be." And I sat there holding my fork and felt the specific stillness that comes from hearing something confirmed that you had suspected but never had said to your face. And I did not respond immediately because I genuinely did not know what to say to that. About 10 minutes later, while the discomfort of the comment was still settling over the table, the doorbell rang and Frank answered it. And there were 2 police officers standing on the porch, and the lead officer said, "Good evening. We're following up on a report of a vehicle parked in front of a fire hydrant. Registration traces to this address," and Frank, confused, said, "We don't have any cars out front except," and Eleanor, suddenly remembering, said, "Oh, that's the car I borrowed earlier." And the officer asked whose car it was. And Eleanor said, "I'm not entirely sure. My son's wife's car, I believe." And the officer asked Eleanor for her license and registration since she had been the one driving it. And Eleanor had to explain, increasingly flustered, that she did not actually have the registration because it was not her car, and she did not know the details of who exactly the vehicle belonged to. Beyond it's my daughter-in-law's. And the officer looked at me and said, "Ma'am, is this your vehicle?" And I said, "Yes, officer, I can get you the registration." And I went and retrieved it from my purse. And the officer looked at Eleanor and said, "In the future, please make sure vehicles are parked legally. Hydrant clearance is required for safety reasons," and issued a citation, which technically went to me as the registered owner, even though Eleanor had been the one driving and parking it. And I stood in that dining room holding a parking citation for a violation I had not committed, in a vehicle I owned, that my mother-in-law had borrowed and mishandled, in the same room where she had just told me I would never fit into her family. I want to be honest that there was no plan in this. I had not orchestrated the parking situation or the citation. It was simply an unfortunate coincidence of timing that arrived 10 minutes after Eleanor's comment. But what I noticed, standing there with that citation in my hand, was the specific quality of Eleanor's discomfort as she realized she had to publicly admit, in front of 2 officers and her entire extended family, that she had been driving a car she could not properly identify, belonging to someone she had just declared did not really belong in the family. And there was something genuinely instructive about watching Eleanor scramble to explain whose car it was immediately, after declaring with total confidence who did and did not fit into her family. After the officers left, Frank asked what the citation situation actually was, and I explained calmly that it was simply my car, registered in my name, that Eleanor had borrowed earlier, and I would handle the citation since it was in my name, regardless of who had parked it. And Eleanor, visibly embarrassed in front of the extended family who had all just watched this unfold, said, "Renata, I'm sorry about the ticket. I'll cover it, of course." And I said, "That's not necessary, Eleanor." And the way I said it carried a different kind of weight than it would have 10 minutes earlier, because everyone at that table had just watched Eleanor need something from me. My registration, my patience, my willingness to handle a citation gracefully, almost immediately after declaring me an outsider, and the contrast between those 2 moments sat in the room for the rest of the evening, whether anyone said anything about it directly or not. David and I left a little earlier than planned, and in the car he apologized repeatedly for his mother's comment, and I told him I appreciated the apology, but I did not need him to manage Eleanor's feelings about it. I needed him to simply have heard what she said and understand why it mattered. And he said, "I did hear it, Renata." And then he laughed a little and said, "And then she had to ask you for your car registration 10 minutes later." And I said, "Yes, she did." And he said, "That's almost funny." And I said, "It really is." I did not bring up Eleanor's comment with her directly in the weeks that followed because I genuinely did not need to. The evening had already supplied something more useful than a confrontation, which was an unfiltered, public moment of Eleanor needing exactly the kind of practical reliability from me that she had just declared I did not embody as part of her family. And I noticed that Eleanor has been different with me since that dinner, not transformed, not suddenly warm, but more careful, more aware that I am paying attention, and I think that awareness, more than any apology she might eventually offer, is the most honest acknowledgement I am likely to get, and I have found that I do not need more than that, because some contradictions, once witnessed by an entire family and 2 police officers, simply do not need to be explained twice.